Well, good evening, good evening, good evening. Thank you very much for joining us for this IEA Book Club event and webinar. My name is Mark Littlewood. I'm the Director General here at the Institute of Economic Affairs. Thank you very much for joining us. You are in for a treat this evening. We have a tremendous topic and speaker for you, and I'm thrilled to be joined by author and environmentalist Michael Shellenberger. He's going to be discussing his latest book, Apocalyptic, Why Environmental Alarmism Hurts Us All. The whole show will last about an hour. In a couple of minutes' time, I'm going to ask Michael to take to the virtual stage and set out his stall for us. Before I formally introduce Michael and a little bit more about him, I just want to go through a couple of housekeeping points for you. All of our guests on the Zoom side of this broadcast, you'll all be on mute throughout, but that's not because we don't want to hear from you. We do want to hear your thoughts and questions, and you can put those in the Q&A box at the bottom of the screen. Please don't you can use the chat box to talk to us or each other, but if you've specifically got a question, please put that in the Q&A box at the bottom of the screen. And whether or not you've asked a question, you can indicate to me which questions you'd like us to put to our speaker by upvoting or clicking the thumbs up button by the questions that you would particularly like us to ask. If you're watching over on YouTube, well, you're either watching on catch up, but if you're watching live, we don't have the mechanism of taking questions over from YouTube. So please consider joining the IEA Book Club, and you can find more information on that on our website, iea.org.uk. Okay, that's all the boring technical stuff out of the way. Let me get on with the main event. I'm delighted to be joined by Michael Shellenberger. He is an American author, founder and president of the Californian-based think tank Environmental Progress, and an actual environmentalist, although one who agrees with quite a lot of his eco-peers. He's been a climate activist for over 30 years. He has personally helped save many nuclear reactors around the world, the impact of which has prevented an increase in air pollution equivalent to adding over 24 million cars to the road. He has been called variously a climate guru, North America's leading public intellectual on clean energy, and high priest of the environmental humanist movement for his writings and his TED Talks, which have been viewed over 5 million times. He's also a journalist whose works have featured in all of the big publications, including the New York Times, the Washington Post, the Wall Street Journal, and dozens more. And as well as this, he is also regularly advising policymakers around the world, including in the UK, the USA, Japan, and Australia. And if that wasn't enough, he's the author of several books, and it's his most recent work, Apocalyptic, Why Environmental Alarmism Hurts Us All, which we'll be discussing this evening. The inspiration for the book came to Michael in 2019 after he saw many prominent figures claiming billions were going to die as a result of climate change. Michael decided that as a lifelong environmental activist and father, he needed to speak out and set the record straight and inject some rational thinking into the modern environmentalist debate. Michael, absolute pleasure to have you with us this evening on our side of the pond. Thank you very much indeed for joining us. Good to have you with us.
Thanks so much for inviting me. I'm delighted to be here.
And so what I'm going to do, Michael, is basically give you the floor to set out your stall for as long as you want, less than half an hour, but perhaps more than 10 minutes or so, and to tell us your themes and thesis and the case that you put in your book. We'll make sure that ways of buying the book are linked to in the chat. And then we'll have a good discussion and a Q&A and both thoughts from that are in my head already, but also from our audience. So the floor, Michael, is yours.
Okay, thanks so much. Well, again, it's a great pleasure to be here. Britain is a country that I care a lot about. We're actually actively campaigning right now for Britain to expand its supply of nuclear energy. I'll mention later that I ended up hiring as our UK director the former spokesperson for Extinction Rebellion, Zion Lights, or Zion, as they say in Britain, who was Extinction Rebellion activist and is one of the heroines of Apocalypse Never. So, yeah, as you mentioned, I wrote this book. I decided to write this book last year. I had been working on a book about nuclear energy, which is something that I changed my mind about 10 years ago. And I was in the midst of writing a book about nuclear energy when it just seemed like everybody went crazy. And Extinction Rebellion started saying that billions of people would die, that, that Earth was dying, that nature was dying. And we started to see the impact, particularly among adolescents. I think that social media has contributed to rising anxiety and depression, both in Britain and the United States. We saw a survey earlier this year that said 1 out of 5 children in Britain are having nightmares about climate change. But I had a number of other motivations, one of which was to really blow the whistle on some bad behavior I see coming from the environmental community to deprive poor countries the cheap energy they need to develop. And finally, I was motivated to set the record straight on nuclear power, which is arguably our most important technology, certainly one of our most dangerous technologies. On the one hand, on the other hand, it's actually one of our safest technologies, which is a paradox I can talk a little bit about. But it needed to be put into some larger context of why we should care about these issues. So what I've done with Apocalypse Never is it really is 3 sections. The first 4 chapters is really why everything we've heard about the environment is wrong. I debunk some of the popular myths. I point out that climate change is real. It's certainly something we should do something about, but we actually already are making great progress on it. Britain's emissions peaked in the mid-70s, along with Germany and France's. America's emissions peaked 13 years ago. Our emissions from electricity declined 10% last year, even under the watch of a climate denier President Trump. That climate change is not the most important problem in the world. It is something we should deal with, but it's not even our most important environmental problems, which tend to stem from our success, not our failure. The deforestation, habitat destruction, poverty, underdevelopment, the fact that 2 billion people still rely on wood and dung as their primary energy. The book draws a lot on my travels through the world, and one of the characters in the book is a small farmer in the Congo, really someone who is struggling to make a living. She's actually a refugee in her own country right now. And I talk about how poor people in poor countries are often evoked by environmentalists as justification for doing something on climate change. But then they turn around and oppose the kind of development projects, hydroelectric dams, roads, fertilizer, irrigation, that would improve the lives of people in the Congo and elsewhere in the world. The second chapter looks at the rainforests. I spent the early part of my career as an anthropologist working in the Amazon, working with small farmers. And I debunk a lot of the popular myths about the Amazon. Basically, what's happening is Brazil is converting its forests into farmlands in the same way that Europe did between 500 and 1500, and then the United States did in the 19th and 20th centuries. And there's a huge amount of hypocrisy, but even worse, or as worse, we see that groups like Greenpeace have actually contributed to the significant fragmentation of the rainforest by opposing concentrated agriculture and the intensification of agriculture for irrational reasons. And that fragmentation has actually been really harmful to the natural environment as well as to the people that live there. After that, we talk about the obsession with plastic waste and the ways in which this obsession really with recycling plastic waste has resulted in a huge amount of plastic waste in the ocean, because the rich countries end up sending we think we're recycling, but we send our waste to poor countries, and then it ends up making its way into the oceans. But that plastic waste, while it has been a problem for some sea life, is not the biggest problem facing sea animals, sea life, whales, and the like. And that a bigger problem is just habitat destruction, often from cattle ranching, from free range, organic type cattle ranching. And that the solutions to plastic waste is waste management. And that's what poor countries need. That's what we do here in terms of landfills and incineration. And then I talk about species extinction, that we're not causing a 6th mass extinction. We're not going to cause a 6th mass extinction. In fact, the amount of land that the humans use appears to have peaked and started to decline. Our biggest use of land in the world is for pasture, for meat production. We use a full 25% of the ice-free surface of the land for pasture. That amount peaked in the year 2000 and has been going down, which is great news for the natural environment, and we should accelerate that trend. And then the second part of the book, I look at how do humans actually save nature? It's something we don't really hear much about, other than protecting parks through conservation, but there's many other more important mechanisms. One of them, which I mentioned, which is growing more food on less land. That takes the pressure off of undeveloped areas, rainforests, and the like. It also prevents the spillover of zoonotic diseases like the coronavirus from bats to humans, assuming that's how it occurred. And so what we want is actually the opposite of what environmentalists have been advocating. Environmentalists have been advocating that we harmonize with nature. What we want to do is actually use less nature. We want to decouple from nature, use less of it more intensively, more efficiently. We also want to create artificial substitutes. We don't want to use, if you want to protect the natural environment, that means you don't want to use it. So the great examples of this are what we did with whales. In the 19th century, we harvested whales for their oil for lighting, and we then invented kerosene from petroleum in the United States to spread around the world. And so we stopped hunting whales at the end of the 19th century because we had this incredibly more abundant, superior alternative to whale oil, which was considered a renewable resource. So fossil energy actually ended up saving the whales in the 19th century. In the 20th century, the Europeans were using the whale oil again for margarine and for soap. And it was really the creation of vegetable oils in general and palm oil in particular that ended up sparing the whales in the 20th century. That is what did it, not Greenpeace protests, not regulations from the International Whaling Commission. And then I talk about energy, which is at the heart of a lot of this book. I talk about why we are so afraid of nuclear energy. I talk about how there's really two motivations that are intertwined, but they're also have a life of their own. One of them is just fear of the bomb. The people on the left, in particular, people on the right tend, at least in the United States and Europe, certainly the case for Britain, people on the right have been more comfortable with weapons, and their view has been, it's good if we have them and our opponents don't. People on the left have been wanting to get rid of nuclear weapons. When that didn't work, and I argue that it can't work for inherent reasons we can talk about, that they displaced their fears of nuclear weapons onto nuclear power plants. Displacement is just a psychological concept very similar to scapegoating. So the left couldn't get rid of nuclear weapons, so it tried to take it out on nuclear power plants. These things are really working on the unconscious. There's very few things I can think of that operate so strongly on our unconscious as nuclear weapons do, though I think, or nuclear energy in general does. Although I do think environmentalism itself is operating as an irrational ideology, mostly unconscious for the people that are really in its grip. And then I talk about why renewables are actually really terrible for the environment. Modern renewables, wind turbines, solar farms, solar projects, they require 300 to 400 times more land than nuclear. Britain had a wonderful professor of physics at Cambridge named David Mackay, died early, unfortunately, from a bad spate of cancer. He was about my age. He himself wrote a brilliant book called Energy Without the Hot Air. David was a bit of a climate alarmist, but he was very pro-nuclear, though a little shy about it until his final interview before his death, where he just points out there's no way you can power a modern society with renewables. It just requires too much land. And we're starting to see that where, the best estimates are, because right now we use about 0.5% of the land for energy, which is great. It's not a huge human impact since humans use about half the ice-free surface of the earth. But according to the best experts, if we were to provide 100% of our energy from renewables, it would require using 25 to 50% of our land, and that's of all of our land on Earth. And so that's insane. It's not going to happen. And instead, what will probably end up happening is what's happening in Germany, which is that the deployment of new wind turbines has basically ground to a halt due to environmental protests and the desire to protect endangered species, which are being killed by the spinning blades of wind turbines, but also by solar projects, since you have to basically clear an entire area of wildlife in order to build a solar wind project. And then the last part of the book asks the question, why, if environmental problems are real but manageable, did we come to see them as apocalyptic? And I look at three things: money, power, and religion. I ultimately conclude that environmentalism is the dominant religion of supposedly secular people, of elites in the Western world, though increasingly in developing countries too. And that gets at a question that had been a stone in my shoe for 10 years, which was, why are the people who are most apocalyptic about environmental problems also the most opposed to the solutions? So, for example, Greta Thunberg, Bill McKibben, they're apocalyptic about climate change, but they are fiercely against the two technologies that have done the most to reduce carbon emissions and that are responsible for carbon emissions peaking and declining in Britain, France, and Germany in the mid-70s, and in the United States, which is natural gas and nuclear. Our movement for nuclear has been so successful that Greta Thunberg was actually asked about it repeatedly. She finally came out in early last year and just repeated all the myths about nuclear. So I raised the question of, do environmentalists really want to solve climate change? Because if they did, we would just do what France did in the 70s and build a lot of nuclear power plants. French electricity produces 1/10 of the carbon emissions as German electricity per unit of electricity for almost half the price. So if what your goal is to reduce carbon emissions, you would just use nuclear power. Or you might use natural gas as a segue, but you wouldn't oppose those two technologies. They do. I think there's something suspicious about a group of people that describe all the reasons they hate modern civilization, the hyperconsumption, the status seeking, the materialism, and then they turn around and say that they're going to save our civilization. And all the things they're proposing are using the food and energy technologies that we used before we became modern civilization. There's two brilliant, beautiful histories of the Industrial Revolution, one by a British historian from Cambridge and another a German historian who unfortunately passed away last year. But they both show, using physical calculations, that the Industrial Revolution was not possible with wood, windmills, and water wheels. You just had to have the power density, the intense amount of energy that comes from coal mining, and then later from hydrocarbons, namely petroleum and natural gas. So I think that we are at a really incredible hinge moment in history. We're experiencing a reversion towards nationalism, even if Trump loses in the elections. And by the way, I just full disclosure, I'm a Democrat, so I have no allegiance to Trump. But I think Brexit, Trump, the reversion towards nationalism suggests that the global political order is in a state of change. And I think that I mentioned in Apocalypse Never that I think that's one of the reasons why the elites in particular are showing so much existential anxiety, constantly talking about existential crisis, which, by the way, was a word that we used to describe, personal psychological crisis. And so the people that seem to be gravitating towards this apocalyptic rhetoric tend to be people that are in the midst of existential personal crises, adolescents, totally natural, they're becoming adults, and then people in midlife seeking some kind of meaning and purpose for their lives. And so there's nothing wrong with religion. In fact, there's a lot that's right about them, but they do better when they're conscious of the fact that they are religions rather than pretending to be something objective and scientific. And also when they are in touch with what I think is a really important set of values, which is love of humanity and love of civilization. And so where the book ultimately ends up going is to affirm a set of values that I would call humanistic. That's not a word that a lot of Christians use, though I think Judeo-Christianity is a humanistic religion in the sense that it believes that God gave us the earth to use as we saw fit. But I think that the humanistic tradition is a tradition that believes in human progress, that believes that humans are special and that humans are good and that human civilization is a blessing. And we need to get back in touch with some sense of gratitude for what our ancestors have created for us and shepherd and continue to shepherd and steward this amazing planet and this amazing civilization, including by dealing with climate change, but also these other environmental problems and realizing the dream of Condorcet and Godwin and other founders of the Enlightenment when they thought everybody on Earth could be prosperous and free. So I'll stop there and excited to have a conversation
Michael,
with you.
fantastic. Really, really interesting. We've already got a whole swathe of questions in the Zoom chat, which I'll come to, but I'm going to completely abuse my position as chair to seize the floor myself and ask you a number of questions that arise from your overview of the book. And I suppose the first is about trying to understand the Extinction Rebellion environmentalist movement. You liken it to a religion. I've heard a lot of other people liken it to a religion as well. Does that make rational discourse impossible? I mean, certainly at the IEA, you know, we're social scientists, not scientists, but any debate about economics, we would assume that the deployment of rational arguments would win. I don't know how I would deal with somebody who said, I believe Keynesian fiscal deficit financing is a good economic policy because God told me so in a dream. I mean, I just wouldn't be able to engage in debate. So is rational discourse possible if this is some sort of pathology rather than people who have looked at the science, taken opinion on the science, and could be persuadable through enlightenment rational means? How does one even engage in the debate?
Well, I think rationality is part of it. We're not completely rational animals, though. We've known that since Plato. Mm-hmm. We're also emotional and I think spiritual animals too, in the sense, and by spiritual, I just mean aware that we're mortal, aware that we're going to die, and thus we're unique in that we need, and this is something that is established through, if you believe psychology can be scientific, I think it's been established very well. We have a natural fear of death, which is a healthy instinct to be afraid of our deaths. But what that does for humans is that leads us to wonder what it means to be alive and why should we bother living? And that was usually answered by religion. And there's many philosophers, the most famous is Friedrich Nietzsche, who in the 19th century saw people going to church but not really behaving as Christians, violating the Ten Commandments, for example. And he thus rightly observed that people that were doing that must not really believe that they would be punished in the afterlife if they were doing it. So he knew that it would result in new religions being created. And he was fantastically confirmed with the rise of fascism and communism in the 20th century. I spent a lot of time in this book, chapter 11 in particular, talking about how environmentalism grew out in some ways of both of those traditions. I'm a little bit more sensitive about how I describe it in the book. You know, I think conservatives have been quicker to point out the ways in which environmentalism draws on a number of aspects of socialism. I point out that it also draws on this British thinker, Thomas Malthus, who in the late 18th century was just outraged by Godwin and Condorcet, the idea that everybody would be able to live decent lives, maybe even forever, and the more romantic ideas of the Enlightenment thinkers, and how that occurred, which I don't mean to digress. But the answer to your question, I think, is that, at least for me, as somebody that identifies still as an environmental activist and engage in environmental activism, and I wrote the book because I care about achieving a better world. For me, you gotta have everything. You gotta have a lot of heart and some feeling to this work, because nobody cares how much you know until they know how much you care. And that's why I talk about why I love nature in the book. And I talk about why I want to save mountain gorillas. I want to save mountain gorillas in the Congo, but I also want the people that live around the gorillas, who are usually ignored by eco-tourists, I want them to be able to have a decent life. I think most people want that. And I want to see the yellow-eyed penguins of New Zealand, which are very endangered. I'd like to see their habitat expand. I think it's important for people to know that I want those things, because the fact of the matter is I don't think everybody wants them, in the sense that there's a fair number of conservatives I talk to who kind of go, you know, we just want universal prosperity and human freedom, and we don't really care about the natural environment. If that's your view, you're not going to have much success winning over Extinction Rebellion activists. And I guess the other thing I would say is that we do need to also have some guts about this. You need to have some courage. I mentioned I hired Zion Lights, who is one of my favorite people in the world right now. I think if we end up succeeding in getting Sizewell C built, that's these two new reactors that they would be identical to the two they're being built at Hinkley C. It would instantly make Britain the global leader, I should say, the leader in the West on nuclear energy. And it would also make Boris Johnson a major leader in terms of climate change. Well, Zion is approaching this work. She was already pro-nuclear when I interviewed her, but she's approaching it with a tremendous amount of courage. I mean, it takes a significant amount of courage to go and recruit a group of people to swim, as they did on Saturday in front of Sizewell, as a pro-nuclear swim demonstration. She did it with my friend Mark Linus as well. So I think all three of those things are important. We definitely need think tanks like IEA, and obviously I wrote the book, 25% of which is references and endnotes, because I do think rational discourse matters, and I'm out there every day slugging it out with Forbes columns debunking all this hyperbolic apocalyptic nonsense about California's fires. But I also know that we have to continue to be advocates, and that requires courage, and that we have to express our feelings and including love, as corny as that sounds, our love of nature and humans as well.
I wonder, just following on from that, again, in your opening remarks, Michael, you raised the question: do the climate change activists really want to tackle climate change? And I'm no expert on the science here, but I've been similarly perplexed, perhaps one might even say irritated, that you don't feel you're engaging with people who would say, well, as long as we can get carbon emissions down to X, and as long as global temperatures only rise by, I don't know, under 1 degree or whatever it might be, I'm satisfied and I'll go home. That once you suggest shale gas as an outcome, that's unacceptable. Nuclear, that's unacceptable. Almost all of the technologies that could assist us here appear to be unacceptable. Is this really an environmentalist movement, or is it watermelon political philosophy that a cynic might suggest that these people want some kind of bizarre Pol Pot style agrarian socialism, and really it's a campaign against capitalism itself, and the best way of presenting that campaign is through the telescope of a potential apocalypse brought about by exploitative multinational companies and the like. But it just doesn't seem there's anything that would satisfy them, that we can't generate energy in clean and efficient ways. I would have thought the Greens should have been all over fracking and shale gas as a fantastic breakthrough. Quite the opposite, it seems, at least in most cases. Is this actually a socialist movement we're dealing with rather than an environmentalist movement?
Well, let's take the two questions separately, because there's sort of two issues, right? Is it a socialist movement? Yes, to some extent, in that if we just define socialism as wanting greater control over the economy. What I point out in Apocalypse Never is that what's different from the environmental movement, from what Marx and Engels advocated, and what Marxists and socialists advocated really up until World War II, up until the New Left of the 60s, Marx and Engels and socialists wanted to harness the creative, destructive power of capitalism and of technological innovation for socialist ends. They remember the famous thing that Marx and Engels say about feudalism. They go, the great thing about capitalism is that it frees people from the idiocy of rural life. They were modernizers, urbanizers, industrializers. And so then it was this marriage with Malthus, which of course, it was the criticism of Malthus was that it was a dismal science. That's where the phrase dismal science comes from. And that's an anti-progressive. Traditionally, Malthus is considered a conservative. I mean, that's one of the questions. How did a conservative thinker like Malthus become the dominant thinker for the radical left in the 60s? So yeah, I think there's part of that. Of course, most environmentalists tend to be the richest people in the world. My friend Brendan O'Neill at Spiked wrote some pretty good columns last fall. He got a sweet quote in Apocalypse Never, by the way, where he observes that a number of the people involved are in the aristocracy. They're not even the bourgeoisie. So you see a sort of alliance between the aristocracy and sort of a middle class aspirational environmentalists combined in this religion. There is a class element to it, but it's really an alliance of the aristocrats plus the kind of intellectual professional elite, the people in media, the people in universities, advertising, creative sectors, together against really the bourgeoisie and the proletariat, which Schumpeter one of his many famous contributions, because he got his creative destruction concept from Marx. But Schumpeter said the proletariat and the bourgeoisie, the capitalists, have a common alliance. Marx was wrong. The proletariats have the same interests as capitalists. It's in revolutionizing the mode of production and basically displacing the parasitical aristocratic elite who are sucking up societal wealth. That's the first question. And the second issue, what's really going on with the activists? In my experience, these are people that are feeling insecure personally. Like I mentioned, they often have an existential personal life going on. They want some meaning and excitement. I have a kind of love-hate relationship with Extinction Rebellion because on the one hand, I'm obsessed with the organization. I love the organization. I hired its spokesperson. But you'll note, when you look, and even, you'll look at, this is the Red Rebel Brigade of Extinction Rebellion, with that kind of deathly costumes. These are theater people. I mean, we all know these people. I was a theater guy for a while. They want to perform. And so they're not that different from the writers, the New York Times journalists, the people that write the catastrophic books, the Bill McKibbins. There's a kind of narcissism there, which is really is showing up a lot in our social media culture. So I think that the alarmism is the goal in of itself for many people. And so, so is it love of nature? Some, I'm not going to say they don't have any love of nature. It's stronger with conservationists than with climate activists. I point out in a recent column that one of the most famous catastrophic authors in the United States, a guy named David Wallace Wells, who wrote a book called The Uninhabitable Earth, which is a bonkers book. I mean, it's nuts. He says in the book proudly that he doesn't like being in nature. He doesn't like camping. Why are you, it was his way of saying, I'm not doing this because I love nature. I'm doing it because I'm here to warn you. I'm the Paul Revere or whatever the equivalent is in Britain, the Cassandra. So, it's a kind of attention seeking. I don't think it's coming from a good place for the most part. People always want me to say, well, don't you think they have good intentions? Some do. I think Zion Lights did. She's shown that. But I think a lot of folks, they don't. And I think that's why they don't want to solve the problem, because if you solve the problem, if you kind of go, if Britain agreed to a full-scale nuclear build-out, then we don't need Extinction Rebellion. You don't need the Red Rebel Brigade. They would just be getting in the way.
Sure. And just before I come to our question, sorry, I'm rather crowding out our audience, but I did want to just pick your brains. You mentioned that I think if I heard you right, Michael, that you about 10 years ago changed your mind on nuclear energy. From an economist point of view, I certainly don't pretend to have any great understanding of the science, but I would take some persuading that nuclear energy doesn't involve gigantic government subsidies. I might be persuaded that those subsidies were worthwhile if that was the only way to stop X amount of carbon emissions, and if X amount of carbon emissions happened, then the planet was going to, go to hell in a handcart. But can you just say a few words on, if I correctly understood that you had changed your mind, why did you change your mind? And if you're a sort of old-fashioned free market economist like me, can you persuade me that this doesn't just always end with the state having to pay for it? Is it actually an economically efficient way of generating energy? Because that's certainly been one of the principal criticisms held up against it.
Yeah, the first thing you have to remember about nuclear energy is that it is a dual-use technology, and people forget this part of it. And the nuclear industry, of course, doesn't like to talk about it. They certainly don't like when I talk about it. But the primary use of nuclear energy is to make nuclear weapons. And the primary function of nuclear weapons, by the way, is to prevent wars. So nuclear weapons are actually being used in that sense as deterrence. And the United States recognized with Britain, famously, Eisenhower and Churchill, they recognized that the West needed to help with the spread of nuclear energy, which may sound paradoxical, but they knew that the technology would spread because that's what technologies do. and that the West needed to be involved. We maintained that commitment for 60 years, but the war on nuclear was so powerful, the fears of the technology were so powerful, that what's occurred is that we are in the process of ceding the technology to China and Russia. And that's a serious national security threat to the United States, to Britain, and to the West. Even if we all end up breaking up and we're not part of, or especially if we're not all part of NATO at some point, letting countries work with China and Russia to develop nuclear power is a threat. And the reason is that the line between soft power and hard power runs directly through nuclear energy. On the one side, it's a multi-billion-dollar construction project. You're in the sphere of influence with soft power. On the other side is a pathway to a weapon. So it's insane for the United States to let Saudi Arabia partner with China to build uranium enrichment facilities and nuclear power plants. So for me, yeah, I mean, so first of all, there's got to be government involvement because it is a dual use technology and it's a national security issue. So I think even if you had to participate in building nuclear capabilities, nuclear energy capabilities for countries around the world, we should do that just for national security reasons. But the economics is not complicated. I mean, nuclear, it's just, I mean, the stuff that is expensive and that really building the plant is just pouring cement, doing nuclear grade welds, using rebar. Most of the components I point out in the book are actually already manufactured in factories, so the cost comes down, the turbines, the steam generators, the piping. So what we know works to reduce the cost of nuclear is just having the same construction workers building the same kind of plants over and over again. When they do that,
there's an economy of scale at that point, basically. Yeah.
Economies of scale. That's why we've been campaigning and criticizing Rolls-Royce and saying, look, there's blood, sweat, and tears in building this crazy new French design. If you'd asked me, it's a third generation design, they call it. If you asked me, they should have just kept going with Gen 2 designs. It was fine. They went with a Gen 3 design, in part under pressure from anti-nuclear people, in part because nuclear engineers go crazy sometimes. But anyway, you guys have spent blood, sweat, and tears in getting Hinkley done. The French have had blood, sweat, and tears in Finland and France. The good news is they've already gone faster with the second reactor at Hinkley C. So if you go do 2 new reactors of Sizewell, they're going to come in much cheaper. It's not heavily subsidized. Because we know what that construction is going to look like, the British have something that's identical to how we did it, which is that the cost of building is just brought into a small amount of payment on electricity bills in advance. That gives the pension funds, private sector investments for people that care about that kind of thing. Private sector investments then have the security to know that we can make an investment in these nuclear plants and they're going to be paying off for 60, 80, maybe even 100 years.
Sure. Okay, I've hogged your time and attention far too long, Michael. Let me be the voice of our audience here and come to some of the questions. I'm going to be pretty democratic here, so I'll start with those that have been voted towards the top of the list. If you bumped into Greta Thunberg and you could tell her 3 things, what would those 3 things be?
What a great question. Well, the first thing I would say, look, I know that you are somebody that really cares deeply about the natural environment. I really believe that. And I think that she was partly made depressed by environmental alarmism. She talks about being made depressed by an alarmist documentary about polar bears, where the news is much better than people think, actually. And that she really cares. I know there's other things going on in her life, but what I would say to her is, I'd say, we're not going to save the environment if we don't care about people, if we don't lift people out of poverty. So would you consider you and your dad coming to the Congo with me, and I'll bring my daughter who's 14. She'd love to meet you, and let's just go and let's see how people's lives are, because some of her behavior has been absolutely unacceptable. The worst of it was when she said, I want you to panic. I don't want my worst enemies to panic, because the word panic, what it means is to behave in an unthinking way. We need to behave in thinking ways. We should want our worst enemies to be thinking. That's terrible. The other thing that was terrible is she tweeted out recently a lot of video of people suffering flooding in India and Niger, which is a country in Africa. She claimed that it was because of climate change. I pointed out in a tweet that ended up going viral that they don't have flood control. I mean, I'm in a hillside, a steep hillside in Berkeley, California. Sometimes when it rains heavily, there's a little bit of flooding. Well, that means that we need to improve our flood control system. You know, we don't, people, I think they don't see it, but we have this elaborate flood control. When it floods in Niger and India, it's because they don't have a flood control system. So they need economic development.
Okay.
So I think that's what I would say.
Let me take a few more. Over recent years, what influence has the media had on the rise of environmental alarmism? Good question from one of our attendees. I mean, I often worry about this. Of course, I'm an enthusiast for a free press, and so, you know, if people say things on the news I don't like, well, too bad. But do you think there is a danger that our news media are inspired by shocking, bad news, panic, even, to use your suggestion there? It's very rare that I turn on the evening news and the newscaster says, not much has happened today, there's not much to worry about, here's Bill with the weather, you know, and that doesn't make a very good news program, right? So is there a problem that's kind of geared into the way that we exchange ideas and information? There's almost alarmism and shock and horror is kind of built into the model. It's a feature, not a bug.
Well, sure. And obviously, if you believe in human evolution, humans have evolved to pay attention to dangerous things. So there's that. I mean, people talk about how Facebook's algorithms choose the emotion of anger and fear. I was like, okay, fine. They call it the Facebook algorithm. That algorithm has been around for the news media for a long time. So obviously, the news media is a big focus of the criticism in Apocalypse Never. It's really three groups, though: news media, Malthusian apocalyptic scientists, activist scientists, and activists themselves. And they work together. Activists put pressure on the scientists and the journalists to be more alarmist. The journalists cover the scientists and the activists to have a story.
Mm-hmm.
So they all work together. I do think, though, I think what's interesting is that social media is disruptive. I mean, I've been criticizing the alarmism around the role of climate change in California's fires. There is a role, but it is not either a necessary or sufficient one for those fires. I've been able to, really get a lot of attention on Twitter in going after our governor, Gavin Newsom, also irresponsible reporters. I couldn't have done that 10 years ago or 15 years ago, writing letters to the editor or op-ed pieces. So I do think something is disruptive. I do think there's room for it. I don't think alarmism, I never thought that my book was going to defeat alarmism, but I thought it could kind of push back and make a dent in it. And I do think we're seeing that. I do see journalists and politicians responding to some extent. They're sort of let's just to stick with this example. They're saying things out here now like, well, nobody denies that the accumulation of wood fuel 5 times more than existed historically in forests is contributing to the fires. It's like, yeah, well, you were denying that a week ago until I started going after you guys. But so I do think some of it we can push back on.
That's interesting and segues into a couple of other questions here. They're different questions, but I'm going to fire them both to you at one time because they both touch on something you just mentioned. One says, as a native of California, Michael, how accurate are Trump's claims that the recent wildfires are not caused by climate change, but are due to poor government management? And then slightly on this pushback, another one of our guests says, what reaction from the environmental community, Greenpeace and others, have you had since your book became public knowledge?
So let's see, just real briefly on the forests, and by the way, viewers can go on my Twitter feed and find, I've done 4 long articles on this. It's in the book.
I think we may have just lost Michael there, or the connection's gone bad at my end. Bear with us. We will do what we can to get Michael back. He was in full flow there. May just take a minute or two to readmit him back into the Zoom chat. I'm told by our technical team here that we're bringing him back.
Sorry about that. I don't know what happened.
I don't know what happened. I don't know what the bug is. So we only perhaps just start your answer again, Michael. We lost you after the first few words. So on the and just to remind you, that's on the California fires was question A, and question B was the reaction from the environmental community to the book.
So, I mean, the short version is just, higher temperatures, some modest contribution to making a natural drought more intense, and a longer fire season. But none of those things explain the intensity of the fires. What the forest scientists say very clearly is that the intensity of the fires is due to the fact that we have 5 times more wood fuel in the forest than we did 100 years ago, because they suppressed the fires over the last century. So we would still be having pretty intense fires without climate change. I think everybody agrees with that. And even more importantly, though, with higher temperatures and climate change, healthy forests survive. So I wrote about a case where these high intensity fires had surrounded a healthy forest. And then when the high intensity fires started to enter the healthy forest, they became low intensity fires, which means they dropped out of the tops of the trees, the crowns of the trees, onto the ground, which is just a beautiful case of how healthy forest management means your forest can survive fires. The other question was, what has been the response to me? Well, in terms of Greenpeace, we've been, my allies in France and Germany have this year, in the last 2 months, have carried out 2 spectacular protests against Greenpeace. I'm proud to report, one in Paris and one in Germany. Germany, they dropped a banner that said climate crisis, nuclear energy. They protested them in Paris. Honestly, I think Greenpeace's influence is declining enormously. So they're not even, and then Extinction Rebellion is in the process of splitting apart, in part because my colleague Zion Lights has left, and she's been pounding on her colleagues to support nuclear energy. They've certainly come after me. They come after me with very personal attacks. They just lie about me. I've responded to all the attacks on my website. Some of it's pretty boring, but a lot of it's had to do with them trying to claim that disasters are getting worse. They're not getting worse. In fact, they're getting better. We can talk more about that, but suffice it to say, there's been a bunch of arguments about the book, but the book has been praised by a number of leading climate and conservation scientists. It's a bestseller, and I think they're struggling to figure out how to deal with me, to be honest.
Well, very specifically on that, Michael, I haven't read the Guardian newspaper's coverage of your report here, but one of our attendees has, and he says, Michael, how do you answer the Guardian newspaper claim? I dare say you've done this on your website, but here's been an example. That, and I'm quoting our guest here, who I think in turn is quoting the Guardian. The well-informed reader will recognise that they, Schellenberger and Lomberg, rely on sources that are outdated, cherry-picked, or just wrong, close quote. As an example, the Guardian says, open quote, Schellenberger claims that wind farms might be responsible for an alarming decline in insect populations in Germany, close quote.
Well, so for just on the basic point, 25% of Apocalypse Never is endnote references of the best available science. And what I will say about that is that I do a lot of our own analysis. We do a lot of energy analysis. I consider myself an energy expert. I was invited by the IPCC to be an expert reviewer, but I tried whenever possible to rely on other people's peer-reviewed scientific research so that there wouldn't be any debate about the sources. I mean, honestly, people assert that kind of thing, but they don't point to any evidence. Okay, the insect example, let me address that. This was a study done by the premier German scientific technical institute. They did an incredible study of the impact of industrial wind turbines on insects. It has never been refuted. And by the way, it was courageous for the scientists to do the study, because when I asked to interview him, his own think tank did not let him be interviewed by me. I mean, it must be enormously controversial. So the idea that the insect study has been debunked is ridiculous. I've just been ignored, and they basically muzzled the main scientist involved. So, and anyway, nonetheless, it's simply put, the chapter on renewables relies on literally over 100 references. So it's not like the whole thing hangs on that insect study or anything like that.
So let's get towards some of the questions which are hovering around potential solutions. Matt Carter asks, and this is very much speaking to the IEA's economist script of how we would tackle this problem. What's your view on the validity of imposing carbon taxes as a way of reducing emissions? That sort of policy approach is very attractive to economists, internalizing the externality. You know, if carbon emissions cost X, tax them at X, just as we do on other, you know, public bads or negative externalities. Do you think that's the correct policy framework? And I'll take that linked to another, because these are about solutions or about the governance structure. What are your views on the Paris Climate Agreement and climate governance more generally?
Well, the first thing I'll say is that first of all, I have no problem with a low carbon price. I've always been fine with that, but it tells you the sense in which of its importance that I talk neither about a carbon tax nor about the Paris Climate Agreement. I don't mention them once in the book, nor do I talk about fusion, nor do I talk about carbon capture and storage, nor do I talk about hydrogen. I mean, there's just a bunch of stuff where people think these are important issues, and then having worked on the book and having even contemplated mentioning them, it just was like, it's really, they're not important. So problem with the carbon tax is everybody knows, and William Nordhaus, who won the Nobel Prize for his advocacy for a carbon tax, makes very clear, is that it is only considered the most efficient mechanism when it's globally harmonized. Well, that's never going to happen, because the Congo should not have a carbon tax. I mean, it's ridiculous. They need to be burning more fossil fuels. So imposing a carbon tax on the Congo is unethical. The places where we've had a carbon tax, the problem is that in order for it to have some impact, it needs to be really big. And as soon as it gets really big, it becomes very inefficient. So, you know, my view is, look, I mean, the book, what I describe in the book is that we are decarbonizing energy by moving from wood and dung to coal to oil to natural gas to uranium. That this is a physical process. And this is my complaint with more right of center free market environmental types, is they fetishize markets. I think markets are important. I have a whole chapter that defends them. You know, it's called Greed Saved the Whales, Not Greenpeace. But the basis of those substitutions is a physical process. So you've got to get beneath the economics and look at the physics of energy. And the physics of energy are, you want to move towards energy dilute fuels towards energy dense ones, from power dilute generation to power dense generation. That's both for farming and energy and cities. That's the main event. And then there's various policy mechanisms to get there. Some of them are more politically popular than other ones. But I think that the obsession with carbon pricing has distracted us from the main event of energy transitions.
Very interesting. A couple of others which go, I guess, to sort of solutions or potential ways of mitigating them. You've touched on one, but again, I'm going to take two together because these are both in the sort of solutions box. What are your views on fracking, on shale gas? And another guest asks, do you agree that veganism is a pathway towards tackling climate change? Could we actually change our habits, our diet in a way that would have a meaningful impact on the natural world?
Yes, I mean, I had there's two subject areas I didn't know anything about when I decided to write the book. There were plastics and meat. I mean, I knew a little bit, but not much. So I had a beginner mind as I approached those issues. I think they're two of the most fun chapters. They start where people are at. I mean, look, the most amazing thing about the whole vegetarian vegan thing is that they're the best available science, and it's multiple studies now find that going vegan or vegetarian reduces your emissions somewhere between 2 to 4%. And part of the reason is the rebound effect, because eating meat is more expensive than eating vegetables or vegetarian diet. You save money, but that money you end up spending on, you know, jet travel or whatever it is that vegans do with their money. All the references are in the book for that. I will say one of the most interesting findings of that chapter, though, by the way, is that most vegetarians eat meat, you know, which is something that, you know, if you know vegetarians or if you've been vegetarian, you know, it's always like, well, maybe I'll just have the chicken soup. You know, over 2/3 of vegetarians admit to eating poultry, which means that what the implication is that vegetarianism is an ideology. It's not a practice. Okay, not eating meat is a practice, but vegetarianism is an ideology. Now, in terms of the question of fracking, people always are like, are you for natural gas or against it? I'm for natural gas when it's replacing coal and anything worse than that, which includes petroleum, though it's not really a substitute for petroleum. but coal and wood, basically. Natural gas, yeah, great. I'm against natural gas replacing uranium. It's still carbon, it still produces air pollution. It still has a much more disruptive impact on landscapes than nuclear does. So again, it's that energy hierarchy that matters. Fracking has been a blessing for the United States. It's the reason our carbon emissions peaked 13 years ago. So if you care about climate change, you should be an advocate of fracking. The technology itself, it's just bonkers. It's the word itself, because it sounds like the F word, that they demonized it. But the process itself is brilliant. The shale is a rock formation about a mile underground in most places. I was a lead investigator of a study of the role of the US government in helping to make that technology happen. It's fabulous, and it's much better than coal mining. And are there some problems with it? Of course, but they're just much less than coal mining, which is the whole point.
Sure. Again, looking at possible solutions here, or whether we're approaching this the wrong way round. Again, I'm going to try and couple these two together. I can shoehorn them into a common theme, I think. William David Henry asks, are the new generation of small nuclear generators likely to become increasingly important rather than huge projects like Hinkley, etc.? And slightly attached to is small beautiful? We also have an attendee asking, have governments done more harm than good when looking to address climate change? The failures of climate global governance surely make the case for moving away from multilateralism or a top-down approach. The attendee references Eleanor Ostrom, the Nobel Prize-winning economist, on how actually you can find voluntary bottom-up solutions to what most economists would consider public good problems. And if it's considered a public good problem, before you know it, there's some colossal global governance network. Could it actually? So these are a bit both on the sort of theme of, I guess, could small be more beautiful or a better solution to this problem than these grand projets, or indeed a colossal sort of global infrastructure to tackle this?
Yeah, so let's see. On the last question first. I'm a huge fan of Eleanor Ostrom, and definitely the story of energy transitions is mostly driven domestically, bottoms up, with some exceptions. I mean, the U.S. government did a really good job in helping the fracking revolution occur. So there's no need to take anything away from that. Similarly, we wouldn't have nuclear energy had it not been for a big government program. So we shouldn't be too dogmatic about these things. Now, when it comes to nuclear, smaller is more expensive, and that's just a scale issue. And the cost, as for most things, it's the labor cost. Well, you don't get to, when you have a reactor that's 1/10 the size of a normal sized reactor, you don't get to reduce your workforce by 90%. That's the problem. Particularly with nuclear. So bigger is cheaper. The Koreans, I point out in Apocalypse Never, they went from having reactors that were 1,000 megawatts to 1,400 megawatts. I mean, that's just a 40% increase with a very small increase in workforce. So bigger is still better. Bigger is still cheaper. And Britain, this is a live question right now. I mean, I'm in an open argument. I'm your friendly Yank, nuclear, friend of Britain, friend of nuclear. I have no financial interest in this whatsoever. And we are campaigning fiercely to just stick with the horse you rode in on, which are these EPRs at Hinkley C. Do them at Sizewell C. I promise you they're going to come in faster and cheaper, unless there's some political interference, which is actually part of the deal not to have, than just this kind of dilettantish, I think, arrogant idea of going and hiring Rolls-Royce. I mean, I see, my understanding is that Rishi Sunak,
our Chancellor of the Exchequer. Yeah.
My understanding is that Rishi, a very sober-minded, up-and-coming politician, is in favor of Sizewell C, and my sources on both the industry and government side tell me that Dominic Cummings is pushing for Rolls-Royce. Maybe Dominic Cummings is right about other things. He's absolutely wrong about nuclear. Rishi, the sober-minded finance guy, and by the way, the finance people are the ones who are often the good actors in this case. It's the engineers who go wild. The finance people want the security of tried and true. And at a moment like this, if I were British, where you don't really know if you're going to have a deal or no deal with your Brexit. Um, Partner with France on a specific project that you already have success with. You need that stability, particularly on this nuclear issue. If you guys do that, Britain will be the global leader on nuclear energy, and we'll have a case to be made that it's a global climate leader as well. And I think that kind of prestige is really important for Britain right now. It's certainly very important for your prime minister.
We're right up against the clock, Michael, but I'm going to try, and I'm not going to be able to get through all the questions, but I'm going to try and put another batch to you here. And this is going to be finishing off really on the alarmism point. One of our guests asks, how can we go about reversing the trend of environmental alarmism with more young people becoming active on the issue, joining Extinction Rebellion or protesting, etc.? How can we turn the tide? Slightly more specific point along the same lines. Another guest says, Michael, I know you probably cannot comment on the UK education system, but can you speak to how the education system in the US is talking to the next generation? Are they helping or hindering the quest for an informed population? Anecdotally, it is only an anecdote, but my 12-year-old niece came home from school, I think it was about a year ago, and said, Mummy, I've decided I'm not going to have any children. And the grounds for that was that she had learnt at school that, the human race was all going to die, or oblivion or apocalypse was going to come. That's only an anecdote. I don't know if she got completely the wrong end of the stick, but obviously that's quite disturbing. So is the education system having, is my niece's experience actually relatively typical, or was that just unlucky? And then I think the third point, which is just to inform and educate our guests and those watching on YouTube, the last question is, as an inspiring undergraduate, can you recommend some books I should be reading on environmental alarmism / skepticism? Obviously, start with Apocalypse Never, £15.98 from Amazon, or we'll also put the links here and in YouTube on how you can buy it directly from Michael's organisation. But what are your thoughts on that, the education system, and any suggested bibliography for our viewers?
Yeah, and by the way, my earpods bonked, but can you still hear me okay?
We can hear you. We can hear you, yes.
Yeah, so I mean, look, I wrote Apocalypse Never in large part for it's dedicated to my daughter and son. My daughter's 14 years old. She's fine because I talked to her about the science, but her friends are also not sure they're going to live long enough to have kids. That's crazy. So what I did in Apocalypse Never is I wrote an environmental studies textbook, but I hid it inside of, I think, a bunch of entertaining stories, sympathetic characters. The book, I believe, is easy to read. People tell me it's easy to read. I wrote it to be accessible. I wasn't trying to be, an Oxbridge professor here, but it does contain a huge amount of resources and references that you can check out. So if you want to read that Apocalypse Never and you're like, what else should I read? You decide and go find it in the footnotes. It's all very much available. Also, the Environmental Progress website has a bunch of graphs and charts that my colleagues have made that are amazing. So yes, are the schools doing wrong? Of course, although it's hard to blame the teachers because they themselves are victims of this apocalyptic virus, which has acted like a vampire squid over the face of humanity for a long time. And so hard to blame the teachers, but yeah, obviously it's really terrible and harmful. So, how do we talk to folks? I mean, like we said, I think it's important for people to know that we care about these things. I think it's important for people to know that we care about climate change, but we all, we care about poverty. We care about endangered species. We all want to see polar bears exist forever. We want to see yellow-eyed penguins. Start with that. Really make sure that people understand that you care about those things, because that prevents them from projecting their own, villain onto you, that you're some sort of a villain or something. And then I think, walking them through these issues, I think Apocalypse Never is meant to be a guide. Like I said, there's like 200 charts and graphs on the Environmental Progress website. And I think we should be patient because, people have been subjected to this propaganda for over 30 years. So it's not going to change overnight. I've had some people say to me, Michael, you should stop pushing back against the alarmism because if you want to win over the left on nuclear. And I'm kind of like, I'm just not willing to lie to people because it makes them feel better. And everybody's grumpy. None of us like it when we're told that we're wrong about something. I was told that I was wrong about nuclear for many years before I changed my mind. I did a TEDx talk, by the way, called Why I Changed My Mind About Nuclear, to own some of that. So, just know that when you
you tell somebody they're wrong, they're not happy about that. They don't want to hear that. Nobody's really very open-minded if we're being honest about it. So we should give ourselves a break and expect that. I mean, I've seen some pretty big changes in the last 2 months that Apocalypse Never has been out. I think give us a couple more years and we're going to see even more changes.
Thank you, Michael, for ending on an upbeat, rational, and optimistic note. It's been an absolute pleasure, Michael, to host you. Just before I finally thank you and remind people where they can buy the book, thank you to all of our guests. Do look at the show notes below. You'll find there how you can buy a copy of the book, either from Amazon, or you can buy a book directly from Environmental Progress. You'll get a signed copy if you give a sufficient enough donation to get Michael's book. Again, the link's in the show notes below. Thank you to all of our guests for joining us. But Michael, of course, my biggest thanks to you. It's been an absolutely fascinating hour and a bit. I'm sorry to have overrun our time by a few minutes, but it's been enlightening, engaging, challenging, but I think also very hopeful and optimistic. So thank you very much indeed for being our guest, Michael.
Thanks so much for having me, Mark. And thanks to IEA for hosting it.
Absolute pleasure. Thanks everybody for watching. Enjoy your day. Over and out.